Hello and welcome to the Political Opinions podcast, where every opinion is given equal footing and political tolerance and debate are given their proper attention in a world where both are on the decline. Today's episode will cover different opinions on a climate crisis. If the title's confusing, don't worry, it's confused me a bit, but I've called it a climate crisis because today we are going to address the question of whether or not climate change and the whole environmental issue we face at the moment is strong enough in its potential danger to warrant a radical enough action that life would genuinely be changed. So it's not just, say, at the moment installing more solar panels. We're talking about an actual radical shift in the way humanity operates. And as we'll come on to see, it is quite a divisive issue. Because not only does it extend beyond this whole debate on whether climate change exists, but goes a lot deeper and addresses many questions on how we actually live our lives in the future. So, let's get into it. Though first off, we have to really address the question of what actually causes climate change. Because the whole argument around those who want radical action and a climate crisis to be declared believe that humans are the blame if climate change occurred naturally. For example, well, there's not much we should really be doing, essentially, but given that to a lot of people humans are the cause, or at least the intensification of climate change, we are to blame. Well, in fact, most scientists actually agree humans are the reason climate change has accelerated so much. Beyond the fact that 97% of climate scientists agree, we just have to look at the numbers. The second humanity starts emitting heavily, the Industrial Revolution, is the same time global temperatures rise, we see increases in CO2 in the atmosphere, and so on. There is not only a strong but an almost perfect correlation between the two. And this, of course, leads on to the question, therefore, that given we are to blame, if we continue to pollute, then we will only worsen the risks of climate change. And there's been this whole debate of the 1.5 to 2, it changes a lot, but this essentially temperature threshold. This idea that once we pass a certain point in the rise of temperatures, it will become natural. Once it gets too warm, a sufficient level of ice will have melted, and there will be sufficient amounts of gas in the air absorbing all of that lovely sun ray and heat that the Earth will continue to warm up by itself. Now, of course, this then leads on to the real point of going green. Essentially this idea that humanity is more than capable of switching to net zero emissions practically. And even then, there are costs, of course, but the costs of going green are always going to be worth it if it means saving the planet. Now, why, you might ask? Well, that's because climate change, to some, poses the greatest ever threat to humanity beyond, say, the threat of nuclear annihilation. The risks of rising sea levels, rising acidity in the water, destroyed ecosystems, severe weather, so we have more tropical storms, more wildfires, just general rising temperatures threatening crops, and so on. The threat climate change poses could be the end of humanity in the worst of cases. And as such, we need to act now to prevent that. Now, speaking of genuine threats, I'd say being submerged permanently in water is up there, and the collapse of the polar ice caps poses one of the most prominent and immediate threats for climate change. Of course, many of these threats may not be felt for, say, 50 years or so in the future, but rising sea levels are occurring right now. Places such as the Maldives have a genuine risk in the next decade or so of being completely submerged, and therefore we need to act to stop much of the world's land from flooding. Now, of course, there is the issue of how do we do it, and more importantly, who does it? Because to some, everyone in the world is impacted by climate change. Climate change doesn't care whether you're rich or poor, whether you live in the richest or poorest country, American, Chinese, Russian, British, African, Australian, whatever it may be. Everyone is affected the same, and therefore it's not a matter of pointing fingers and blaming and taking responsibility on certain people, but rather everyone taking responsibility for climate change and saying we as a planet need to change. Because if only, let's say just the UK went climate neutral tomorrow, wouldn't make a difference if countries like India and China ramped up their emissions. And therefore everyone needs to act, because the bottom line is that the threat of climate change is so immense that no matter the cost, action must be taken. And any potential hardships today, for example, if we're not able to travel as far in electric cars, is offset by the fact that the world may simply become uninhabitable in the future if we do not change today. If I have scared you about the future, I'm sorry about that, but luckily there is an entire side to this debate which is often neglected, but is nonetheless prevalent in many areas of modern society. And that is for those people who do not believe a climate crisis is the solution. And well, the first question is of course why. Now, to say that all scientists support the view that climate change is caused by humans is wrong. And there are a small but nonetheless prevalent group of scientists who argue that humans are not to blame for climate change. The Earth, throughout its entire history, has had periods where it has warmed up, then cooled down, then warmed up again, and right now we are in a wave, essentially. I mean, you never know, we could have an ice age starting next year, for all I know. But the point is that to some, they doubt the fact that humans are entirely to blame. But more than that, they say that a climate crisis doesn't do much. On an almost ironic note, some people argue that CO2 saturations are currently so high in the atmosphere that reducing emissions at this point won't do anything. Essentially, if we've already reached this threshold, there's no point, we can't stop it. We need to learn to live with it. And the reason we need to learn to live with climate change and not counter it is because the cost of countering it is simply too immense. For example, the cost of going green tomorrow would be immense. It would cost the world tens of trillions of dollars, and it would cause a massive amount of upheaval in the way humans live. If it's reducing the amount of energy we consume, changing all of our eating habits, swapping out all of the world's infrastructure to be electric, which at the moment would just mean no more plane travel, for example. All of these things would be massively detrimental to people's quality and standard of living, as well as just general convenience. And as such, some argue the world is not ready and may not be ready for a very long time to switch to this so-called green living. And another reason people might argue this is because they believe the threat levels of climate change are actually overstated. Not only, as we have said before, are many of them arguably in line with natural atmospheric changes and general environmental changes, but we will learn to adapt. The Earth has always undergone change, and there is nothing new about it today. For example, melting ice caps could even be viewed as a positive. Melting the ice caps means that boats will now be able to travel, for example, from the UK straight to Russia and China. They can go up and over the top, essentially, through the North Pole of North America, something that couldn't be done before. Obviously, you have the Panama Canal, but this is simply a new sea route, and therefore, there could actually be a benefit. So, not only is it arguable, and we'll come on to it in a second, that humans can adapt to the way we live, but we might also get some benefits from changes in the world. Now, this benefit will be felt by everyone, and that is quite important, because one genuine concern for a climate crisis is that it will only perpetuate current global inequalities. Western countries industrializing from the 1800s to today are the main contributors to the overall amount of climate change that have occurred, even if we emit far less than, say, India and China in the modern world. The total cumulative impact is far greater. And given that we are countries that already emit less and don't need the emissions for development, the countries that suffer the most from an adaptation to climate change are the ones who actually have benefited least from climate change. Poor countries should not be denied, to some, the same right to develop through fossil fuels that Western countries had. It's unfair to say, well, we did it, but it doesn't matter that you're trying to do it, we've already done it, you're just going to stay poor because we all need to go green. No, some people argue that is not fair, and it will again cause massive amounts of harm to poor nations. If they can't use fossil fuels and then can't afford all of this expensive new green technology, there's a genuine issue there. And therefore, again, if we weigh it all up, some argue that instead of having a climate crisis and doing all this radical shift in the way we live, we should instead balance the risks of climate change with the practicalities of life. Now, I don't believe any genuine and informed person can argue that climate change isn't happening and doesn't pose at least some threat. But what many people might often forget is that the cost of changing might be too great. So to some, instead of trying to stop climate change, if we instead focused our efforts on adapting to it, life might be better off, actually, in the future. This entire debate highlights a number of key issues. Of course, we have the cause, whether it's human or just natural, economic factors, so for example, if we pollute, we only worsen the risk of climate change, and once we pass a certain threshold, there is no stopping it, versus the belief that, well, we're so far in we can't do much now, the general cost of going green, and the fact that some believe humanity is capable and some isn't, fairness, whether the environmental risks are there or not, and so on. But the core underlying argument is essentially this weighing it all up view. If we look at the total cost to benefit ratio of adapting to counter climate change versus adapting to live with climate change, we see the real divide in this issue. Of course, it would be great in a perfect world to just become electric like that and suddenly everything's fine, but the cost is so immense and so unfair in many places that we really have to ask ourselves, is it worth it? And that is the key point of comparison and the key point that contrasts here. Some believe we should go green because the environmental cost will be so immense that nothing else matters. But others take a step back and say, hang on a minute, we have to consider the human impact of actually changing our lives. There is more to the world than just climate change. The environment won't necessarily collapse and die like that, so we have to be smart about it and work within the practicalities of what we are able to achieve. Overall, what this debate really highlights is the difference between those who are strongly behind climate specifically and those who look at other factors as well. The ultimate divide comes down to how important you think climate change actually is, because yes, again, it's hard to argue climate change won't change our lives dramatically, but whether it will be totally negative is up for debate. So again, that real point of contention we have to remember and cannot forget at any point is whether or not climate change is just so great of a threat, no matter the cost, action must be taken, or whether we should instead balance the risk of climate change with the wider practicalities of living. With the current COP26 climate summit in Glasgow being hosted by the UK, hopefully, at least for me personally, some sort of action will be taken. And we'll get more than just words from politicians, because climate change is a threat and action is needed to stop especially its worst effects from happening. But that being said, we still cannot forget that there is a whole world beyond the climate. And although it is so important to us, if we were to disregard everything else, that poses another whole set of questions and risks to humanity. So, for now, we'll just have to wait and see, but we can always hope, can't we? With that being said though, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments or on Twitter. Be sure to check back next Monday for another episode. Thank you, of course, once again for listening, and I hope to see you all soon.